So thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so you've heard the perspectives from different perspectives here from a data provider, the coordination and management, the actual task of integrating the data, and I'm going to cover a little bit in a moment about the broader strategic lessons that we've learned from this project. Mine is less technical, and it's more about the actual broader picture of lessons learned. So, yeah. Hindsight, of course, is a wonderful thing, and Eurographics inherited the achievements and the outstanding challenges from the ELS project, and we've taken that forward in terms of the Open ELS project as well. Some services have been provided. Participants, though, have learned an awful lot, and you've heard some of those lessons this afternoon. And indeed, the project has contributed significantly to the actual implementation of Inspire services and the broader lessons learned. So we've learned a lot, but gaps remain. There are a number of gaps remain to be addressed. And we know now also that there is evidence, or little evidence, shall I say, that Eurogeographics on its own can actually solve these sorts of lessons. And commercial partnerships approach was tried. This has not been successful. So we have to ask ourselves, well, okay, how will we take that forward going in the future? So we're trying to create a pan-European authoritative geospatial data services, and at the heart of that, they must be sustainable. We can't just do this as a project and then at the end of the project, it ends and finishes, and so really that's something we must do. And we've heard of some of the technical challenges that exist, but there are also policy challenges, legal challenges, and of course the financial one. So looking at each of these in turn, the technical side, we've heard about the data model interpretations, the complexity of the data schemas. There's also been issues about client software being able to consume the services that exist. We didn't hear so much about that in this afternoon, but that's certainly been part of the project experience. And that leads to things like version control of the various the data schema that exists out there. We've also heard about centralized infrastructure or distributed infrastructure. And then at the bottom of all of this has to be content, the availability of content. So there are still some technical challenges there. On the legal side, we have to recognize Europe is a complex place. There are multiple legal jurisdictions. Centralized licensing framework does work, but actually there are national requirements sometimes that creates an obstacle, which means that we have to create multiple agreements with multiple countries, and that's administratively a significant task and not straightforward. Today, however, we've seen the Open Data PSI directive, and we think this could actually be quite a game changer in terms of helping us open up and release and overcome some of these varieties that exist. At the policy level, different national data policy regimes exist, and there are different interpretations in each country about privacy, and of course different interpretations about even what is meant by open data. So what one country says is open data is not what another country necessarily agrees is. And again, we see this impact of the Open Data PSI directive perhaps helping us to address some of those problems. But of course we still have that underpinning reality of Europe, of the multiple regimes that exist there. And then at the heart, as I've said, is sustainability. Financial sustainability is fundamentally the core challenge that we face going forward. And I wanted to just highlight a very simple diagram about what we're talking about. You have data suppliers and you've got data users, and somebody in between has to organize things. You've got to manage and coordinate the provision of supply to the user. There's a supply integration and distribution activity there if you really want to create pan-European services. And that requires some technical infrastructure. And out of that very simple diagram, you have some fundamental questions. okay, who pays? Who is the person or organization that coordinates this? And where's the leadership come in? What's the legal form of the entity that does this? So, leadership's needed. Yeah, Inspire Directive today is 12 years old, and the concept actually is much older. I can certainly remember it back in 1999 being discussed, and I'm sure people were talking about it even earlier than that. And today things have moved on, both technically and clearly politically as well. We've got new entrants into the market providing geospatial data, new types of data, artificial intelligence, big data, Earth observations, and of course new technologies. We also have a United Nations policy framework with global sustainable development goals. And they've developed the integrated geospatial implementation framework. And we're coming to the end of the Inspire implementation period, but of course moving into what's that's the hardest bit. That's the maintenance part of this. So what next for Inspire? How's it going to be maintained? And who actually is in leadership, going to give that leadership in Europe? It's not that clear to me, I have to admit that. Compliance of Inspire remains a member state responsibility, but actually there is no requirement for anyone to use those Inspire services. And that's one of the fundamental challenges and lessons learned from our activity within these projects. We actually don't see a clear political or policy home for geospatial information in Europe, nor geographically, nor within the European Union. And we believe that the developments at the global level, particularly United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management Initiative, demand a coordinated European response. The lack of an integrated geospatial policy backed up by core reference data from authoritative data providers will, we believe, severely hamper the European digital economy and the effectiveness of public administration. And we note that elements of geospatial policy is being dealt with by different parts of the European Commission, different parts of the Council and Parliament in different ways. And as a consequence, we don't actually see it being greatly joined up. The Inspire infrastructure is quite strong, yes, but I'm talking about at the policy level and the ownership of it. We actually do believe that there should be an agreed geospatial policy right across Europe. It should be implemented horizontally and in particular within the Commission and not dealt with in silos by different parts of the Commission. And in that way, that our members' data in Eurogeographics, actually their data is going to be used for the important decision making that affects all of our lives. And of course, other data sets as well. This is a very open field, but authoritative data has its role. So, in conclusion, I thank you for everyone for your interest. We're going to open it up now for some discussion and questions. Carol will do that. I'll run that, Dominique, just for a minute, and then maybe colleagues will answer any particular questions that arise. So, would the Open Data PSI Directive make projects like Open ELS more successful in terms of authoritative data provision? Anyone want to say? I can answer that, shall I? I can address that. Well, I'll take an observation. Yes, of course it will, because within 2 years, national governments are going to have to implement the Open Data PSI Directive. And that means, during those 2 years, the Commission will be identifying what they call high-value data sets. It's still unclear how or who will fund the maintenance of such data, but in the understanding that data will be released, then the provision of the data is simplified because it's there, it's available, and hopefully accessible. You still have some of the problems that Anya outlined, which is somebody's going to have to integrate it if you wish to create pan-European data sets. Now, either that's done centrally by an organization tasked to do it, or the users has to do it. And if the user has to do it, you will get very complex, and it's certainly inefficient, but certainly complex outcomes and differing outcomes. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that. And please, if anyone disagrees, put your hand up and say. There's no. Is funding the main problem for not provision of data, or are there also other issues, e.g. organisational? Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in open data for many, many years, and there are a number of challenges there about opening data. And certainly, I mean, Doris, you mentioned how people weren't willing to provide their data till they knew there was a user there. Equally well if there wasn't any funding. So, and there's an organisational mindset about releasing data as well, particularly beyond national borders. So, yeah, there are other issues, but they tend to be maybe cultural as well as some of the things I'm talking about. The main thing is to create momentum. You get some countries providing data, others will begin to get on board. And there are a few leading lights in Europe, for sure, certainly on the open data front. But you still have some cultural issues there, I think. Anyone?
Maybe I will add, because I mentioned the two types of data under diverse regimes, and it was due to the legal condition. The base registry outputs from the law can be published, are recommended to be published for reuse, and the production of the products of the Land Survey Office from the law is connected with budgetary, with some income. So then you have it. In the law, you are not just to tell, okay, I send it out. And we had it at the beginning with the base registry as well, that some income was supposed. And to change the approach, we had to change the budgetary rules regarding the organization, get it improved by the government and by the parliament. So it's not just a local decision, it depends on the legal context and rules in the particular country regarding the particular organization.
Thanks, Eva. Okay, so the next one. Do you agree that only public bodies can be providers of authoritative data to the European Commission? Well, no, they don't have to be public bodies. We've done a bit of work in Eurogeographics on behalf of our members, looking at what do we mean by authoritative data. And we've come up with I can't remember the exact definition, but we're certainly going to be publishing a paper on what we mean by it. But usually somebody in a country has a mandate to provide official data. Now, the mandate can be legal or administrative in some form. And usually that mandate has some form of validation in terms of quality associated with it. And therefore that provides the authority to be used maybe in a legal context or a judicial context or administrative context. It doesn't have to be a public body, no, but the importance is that the mandate exists, and that organisation is recognised to have the authority to provide it to inform certain public decisions. And I suppose one of the tests for me would be, well, if you were presenting information to a judge, would the judge accept it? Now, in the absence of an authority, then of course another body may be able to provide that authority, and so it's perfectly acceptable. But in many countries, legally, that is mandated activity and is the responsibility of a public body.
Because I've opened this issue in my presentation. In particular decision-making processes or activities, the authoritative data is required at the national level. Otherwise, you will not be recognized by certain bodies as the person or as the organization. And to build up the maintenance and provision of the data of the required quality means a lot of efforts, and it means the structure of the address, which is required the updating processes, etc. And those who update the data are authorized and authenticated, or you know what I mean. And so when you have in the country, it's not necessary that it exists in all countries, but there when it exists, it's then decreasing the quality if the Commission starts to use the content which is from other sources. It might seem that, for instance, the other person or the other provider used some more rich geographic names description, but in the country they are strictly defined administrative units which define also the display of competencies from the geographic point of view. And in case that the Commission plans that some decision making will be done across countries, across Europe, you need to guarantee that it was a relevant body in a relevant place which was the responder, and you got a trusted, an output which you can trust, because otherwise you can sell a house or just make some investment elsewhere, but on some basis which will not be legally valid. So it's not against the users, but in some processes this is really very needed to have the relevant source of information which you can rely on. It's not for everybody, it's not for all the many services, but there are certain services that this should be very carefully defined and the players defined and the recognition of the input refined and the content which is relevant used. Otherwise it goes really backwards and the Commission would undermine the e-government rules within the countries, and it's not right.
Hey, any other points? So, yes, please.
Yeah, I was quite surprised basically hearing about this issue on capacity building and ELS. So can you maybe elaborate a bit more on that? Because what does it mean? What is the conclusion then? That everybody, the data providers are very well fit to do the provision of data, or because very often in GRC we hear from the member states that the capacity building is a problem. So now we see you didn't spend really the money, the fundings for the capacity. It's a bit strange. I don't know.
Yeah, we thought as well that it's strange. Yeah, maybe it has because there was a link with providing the data. So if you have no plans in providing the data, you would maybe not ask for capacity, because if we deliver capacity, the least thing we ask back is then, okay, provide the data then. So maybe that was the link, but it was really, we did a lot of regional context that we presented what we were supposed to do and how we could help, and there was almost no response. Yeah. So
Strange. Thanks.
In some cases, this is where the policy differences can make a play. So in some countries, you actually have a policy whereby your data, the whole country's data, from the authoritative provider, can't actually leave the country. And so it might be that they need capacity building to get the services, but from a policy point of view, they're not allowed to address that. So there's something behind that that's worth exploring, something differently.
Time is out. So to conclude this session, I will just remind that in Inspire Helsinki we had a workshop about use of Inspire data last year. The results are available on the Eurogeographic website. Some of the user complaints were about various kinds of download services, licensing, about Inspire puzzle, about complex data models. Eurogeographic's initiative have tried to tackle these issues with some limited success, but lots of lessons learned. And I will say Inspire is generally considered as a first and significant step towards interoperability, but next steps are necessary, and I hope this workshop will help to think about these new steps, and hopefully discussion to be continued in Dubrovnik.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for your contribution and your participation.